All right, we're going to have 4 this week. They were going to be 2, but then they kind of grew beyond that. And I wanted to make it something that was more bite-sized pieces. So we're going to start with Genesis chapter 15. You may say, John, we've been going through Galatians. Why Genesis 15? This is where it talks about the covenant God made specifically with Abraham. And I want you all to understand that because that's really tying into a lot of what Paul is teaching in Galatians. In fact, he's going kind of against their interpretation of the law, but he's not disrespecting what happened. And so let's look and see what happened. What I want you to know is in Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 6, God has just taken that time to promise Abraham massive rewards, offspring that would outnumber the stars and outnumber the grains of sand. I mean, just incredible things that God had made promises to Abraham about. Abraham's response, starting in verse 6, is this: Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. I'm going to read that again. Starting in verse 6, Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. What is he saying? Well, he's really laying out this concept, this idea. Abraham, if you believe me, if you trust me, I'll credit that to you as if you've always been faithful here. Verse 7, he goes on. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. Abraham's response, but he said, Lord God, how can I know that I will possess it? Then in verse 9, something that seems very peculiar to us begins to happen. And that's really what I want to explain in this video. It says, he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So he brought all of these to him, cut them in half, and laid the pieces opposite each other. But he did not cut the birds in half. Birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, a deep sleep came over Abram, and suddenly great terror and darkness descended on him. It was at this point that God begins to speak to him. And in verses 13 through 16, God lays out for him what will happen to his descendants while they're in captivity in Egypt. He lays out exactly what can be expected and what's going to happen. Well, then in verse 17, it picks back up. When the sun had set and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Now, what I want us to see here, and that we won't pick up if we're just studying this in English, is that word made in verse 18. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. If you go and look at what that word is in the original Hebrew, it's a word that we pronounce karath or karath. As we look at that, what that word literally means is to cut. It's the idea of cutting off something, to cut off a body part, to cut out, to eliminate, to kill. It's also the word that they use to cut a covenant. Well, that didn't make sense to us because we weren't familiar with how a covenant was made. But this in the text really helps us understand this. See, what God had said is, hey, go get this cow and go and get this goat and go and get these animals. And what I want you to do is I want you to take them and I want you to cut them in half and lay them on their sides opposite each other. This is a process that seems foreign, peculiar, strange to us. This is a process that even seems grotesque if you really think on it. But what was happening is exactly what was their tradition. They would have these covenants that were made, and you would have two parties of the covenant. One was the greater portion or the dominant portion of the covenant being made, and the other was the lesser. See, the lesser was the one who is coming to the dominant party and saying, hey, I need this, or I would like this, or this is the agreement that I would like to make. This would obviously be something that the greater party is giving to the lesser party. And so what the lesser party would do is say, hey, here are my conditions. Here are the conditions that are to be made with this covenant. You pay me this amount, or you do this thing, or you accomplish these purposes, and I will give you this in response. It's similar to like what we would do with a loan. We would go to a bank, say, hey, I'd like a loan for this. And they would say, yes, but you have to pay this much back with interest, and it has to come in these payments. Well, back then, what would happen is the lesser party would bring those animals or bring these sacrifices. And depending on how big the covenant was, the agreement was, would depend on how many animals they would bring or what was going on. And so this seems like a significant amount. These are several animals' lives. And what God is saying, bring those and cut them in half. And in doing so, he would lay them side by side. And as he's cutting these animals, a trench of blood would form in between the animals, and it would make a bit of an alleyway where on each side are these dead carcasses that are bleeding out right there in this trench. And what would happen is the lesser party would be the one to cut those, and then they would walk between those animals. They would walk between that sacrifice. And the words would be said that were similar to this: may it be to me as it is to these animals if I break my end of the covenant. What they're saying is, may it be just like me as they're walking through pools of blood with their sandals and feeling the blood on their feet, as they're walking between and they're seeing these carcasses completely drained of life, and they're seeing this, they're saying, may it be to me if I don't live up to, if I don't fulfill my end of the covenant. Well, that's where this story gets especially intriguing to me. It's where, as we're paying close attention, we'll notice something quite peculiar. Let's go back to verse 17. Look what it says. When the sun had set and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. Now, if you remember in the text, Abram wasn't the one carrying the fire pot. He was the one whom the deep sleep had come over. He was laid down and he is seeing this happen. Who's the one carrying the fire pot? It's the greater of those making the covenant. It's the one who is providing all of this promise, is the very same one who's carrying that fire pot through that trench of blood, saying, may it be to me if you don't fulfill this covenant. Look what it says. When the sun had set and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. On that day, the Lord made, as we know, should be translated, cut a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your offspring, from the brook of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River, and the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Kadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. What is he saying? I'm going to make this covenant. And he's saying, may it be to me, as it is to these animals, if you don't fulfill your end of the bargain. Well, we know well enough to know that we didn't fulfill our end of the bargain. We couldn't live up to the law. We never did. And just like God had promised in this moment, he said, may it be to me as it is to these animals if you don't fulfill your end of the bargain. What happened is God walked through that covenant. God made that covenant with us. And then God, in the very form of Jesus, gave his life. May it be to me if you don't do what I've called you to do. It's an incredible picture. What Paul is saying in Galatians is that it wasn't by us performing well enough. It wasn't by us living up to the law. It was by us trusting God to fulfill the covenant that we never could. Pray on that. And if you've not given Jesus your life, hear him today. Hear his call and trust him. If you want somebody to walk with you through that process, text the word HOPE to 417-256-3128. Have a fantastic day.